Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. I used to be a security guard for a small warehouse in my city. It was an overnight job, which wasn't ideal, but it paid really well compared to other jobs of a similar nature. The warehouse wasn't particularly large or impressive, and the company that owned it sold expensive tech items, so I suppose it was necessary to have the building under constant surveillance. All I had to do was watch the cameras moving around, and I rarely fill out reports. But this night it was raining a lot, and there was a little bit of thunder. To be honest, even though it was a little eerie, I felt more relaxed because I knew that no one would be leaving. I went in and spoke to the closing shift workers as they left, having the warehouse to myself starting at 10:30 p.m. until 6 in the morning. After 2 hours, I took a break from watching the camera footage and got up to do a standard security check. I went all the way down to the far end where the majority of the actual storage section of the building was located. Normally, the building was really quiet with only a little creaking, but with the rain pelting down on the roof, it was nearly impossible to hear anything else. After that, I started to walk to the other end of the warehouse when a faint beeping sound started to reverberate through the hallway. This was a security room alert, so I hurried over to check it out and discovered that it was a latch sensor on the back door, indicating that someone had attempted to open it. I then opened the live camera feed that covered that door, but no one was outside. After a minute, I went to the back door to inspect it myself, thinking that perhaps the sensor wasn't working properly, or that the rain had damaged something. I turned off the alarm and opened the door, then looked around and saw nothing unusual, just an empty alleyway behind the warehouse. The door itself appeared to be in good condition. Despite my lack of expertise, I tested it, and it never misfired or failed to detect the latch. I checked my surroundings again before closing and locking it, but even though I didn't see anyone or anything, I still had to file a full report on the incident because the alarm had appeared in the system. So I returned to the security office and began filling out the paperwork. Just a few minutes in, a thud reverberated throughout the building. I jumped up and looked down the hallway, not knowing exactly what it was or where it came from. I left the room and stood there, listening for any additional sounds, but all I could hear was the rain hitting the roof. I carefully crossed the building, scanning the shelves for any there were fallen boxes or obvious damage, but as I approached the front of the building, the rain began to get louder. I turned the corner and stopped, looking across the warehouse, where the front door was ajar and I could see the reflection of water puddles on the floor, probably from someone who had entered the building. I ran back, locked myself in the room, and pressed the emergency button to call the police right away. As I waited, I heard some thuds coming from inside the building, and then everything was quiet until the police arrived. I waited in the front and reported the incident to one of the officers, while the other to search the warehouse, and returned. A minute later, the man in cuffs was said to be hiding behind some boxes in the storage area with a hammer in his hands. As he passed by, he gave me a chilly look that appalled me. A few days later, the police reported that the man appeared to have been under the influence of multiple drugs and gave no explanation for his actions, leaving it unclear what he intended to do. But after breaking in with force, he was hiding with a hammer in his hands. He was so drunk that it's impossible to predict what he might have done. Fortunately, he's still in jail, and I no longer work overnight at a spooky warehouse, but that night still makes me feel terrible, especially on rainy nights when I can't see or hear my story to surroundings. I work as an officer for our local police department, Our shifts are constantly changing, with people working 10 to 12 hours on a different schedule every week. On this particular day, I was working 10 p.m. until 10 a.m. and was at the office when a dispatcher informed me of a call regarding a group of teenagers trespassing on private property. Specifically, it was a hospital on the outskirts of town that had been abandoned for the past 10 years. The entire department was aware of this and the majority of when I arrived. I immediately noticed a flashlight shining through the windows. We had been there a number of times before, and I was certain that it would be a simple and straightforward case of walking in and either escorting a group of friends out or watching them run off. I was exhausted, so either was sufficient for me. I really didn't care too much to arrest and charge them. I just needed them to leave the property. I got out of my car, prepared my flashlight, and went inside the building. The first thing I did was call out for everyone to show themselves and such, but of course no one did. I listened at the entrance for any noises that would hopefully give me a clue as to where to look, but it was completely silent. The strange thing about the second story was that it was moving really quickly across multiple windows, like someone was running through the hallway. I believe there was always a small worrying that it might be a trap to lure an officer in and try something, but I remained calm and went through the old hallway and up the stairs. Just as I got to the top, a thud reverberated throughout the building, sounding like someone hitting a wall. This was sufficient to wake me up and get my nerves going, and was unquestionably from the second floor. I went into the hallway and shone my flashlight all the way down, but I couldn't see anyone. I called out again very forcefully, knowing that the stairs I was near were the only way to go up or down from the second story. I remained there and listened again, but all I could hear was creaking of the building. I moved slowly down the corridor, peering through each door and using my flashlight to scan the rooms, but all I saw were graffiti and dilapidated hospital beds. When I reached the final room, the door was closed, so I called out again before swinging it open, clearing the room but finding no one there. However, there were indications of recent activity, such as cigarettes on the floor and smoke still rising from them. This was very alarming because they hadn't left the second floor via the stairs, and the only other possibility was that they had leapt out a broken window. Before I could even check, the door behind me slammed shut, something smashed against it, and footsteps left down the stairs. By the time I got out, the person who had been there had long since left, and backup arrived. We conducted a more thorough investigation and checked in with the person who had initially called in the two teenagers. Fortunately, I managed to push the door open enough to slide through the opening without noticing that a large hospital bed was pressed against it. What was strange about this was the fact that there was only one flashlight in the window and only one distinct set of footsteps, along with the cigarettes still burning, indicated that they had departed quickly, which might have been due to my arrival. However, why would one of them have remained behind? In the morning, we received a report from a mother regarding her teenage son who had gone missing. Soon after, another mother reported the same thing about her teenage son. After investigating it for days, weeks, and months, it was almost certain that they wouldn't appear. And now, 6 years later, they still haven't. Their disappearance is improbable, which is what makes it so challenging. It's unclear if the person in the hospital with me was one of the two children, but the most reliable theory at the moment is that it was someone else, and unless something new emerges, story 3 is unlikely to ever happen. It was a snowy night when I pulled into my gas station's parking lot. I had been working the overnight shift, which ran from 11 to 7, for several months prior to this. I didn't particularly enjoy my job, but it was really hard to find another one because of the state of some other areas of my life. Even though I struggled to finish every shift and arrived exhausted every night, night shifts were the best for my schedule. I parked in front of the building next to my co-worker's car, the only other car in the lot, and went inside to relieve him of his shift. He left a few minutes later, leaving me alone for the remainder of the evening. My manager had a paper on the desk with some things needed to be done, but after reading it over, I realized there wasn't much. I estimated that it would take no more than an hour to finish everything, so I tried to put it off as long as possible to avoid falling asleep once I started to feel extremely exhausted. But as I sat behind the desk, it was around 12 a.m. when a car arrived into the station. I looked out the window and saw an old SUV parked near one of the pumps. Of course, since it was snowing outside, nobody was driving, but occasionally receiving a customer was as usual. I returned to my phone and watched a few videos without really paying attention for about 10 minutes. When I looked outside again, I noticed that the SUV was still near the gas pump. The headlights were off, and the doors were closed, giving the impression that they should be pumping gas, but it had been so long that I got up and moved closer to the window, looking down the building on both sides, but no one was there. No one was there, since it was cold, windy and snowy outside, and they had been in their car for 10 minutes with it off. I must admit that I became a little anxious for them. I focused harder for the next few minutes, hoping to see if anyone was getting back into their car or if there was any movement through the dark windows, but there was nothing. It was as if the car was just after some consideration. I put on my jacket and went outside right away. I realized right away that it was much too cold for anyone to be inside the car with the car off or even to be outside for more than a few minutes. I hurried over to the car, took a quick look around, and then put my face close to the window and attempted to peer inside, saying, "Hello, anyone in there, just checking to see if you're okay." I called out, but it wasn't easy to see, so I was fairly certain there wasn't anyone inside. Now, even more perplexed, I backed up and glanced around at the deserted gas station parking lot before beginning to walk. I was staring at the ground, not the car, when I noticed shoe prints in the snow heading toward the building. They weren't exactly in front of the building, but rather off to the side. I looked back and saw that they appeared to be from the car, but I was freezing at this point and didn't want to look into it any further without before a thump reverberated through the building from behind me. I warmed up a little by going inside and turning on the small heater next to the counter and placing my hands in front of it. I spun around, seeing nothing, then walked around the counter, and as I approached the back room and turned the corner toward the supply room, I noticed puddles of filthy water on the floor near the back that looked like snow that had melted off someone's boots. In the darkness behind one of the shelves, I could make out the outline of my heart briefly stopped when I saw the tall, broad-shouldered, scruffy-bearded figure staring directly at me. But after the initial shock, I simply walked back to the counter. I'm not sure why. Perhaps I was simply too shocked to respond appropriately after staring at the doorway to the supply room for an unknown amount of time. I silently picked up the store phone and called the police, pleading for assistance. Then, I waited for the most terrifying 10 minutes of my life without hearing or seeing anything from the supply room, which only made me more terrified because the man never came out to face me. When two police officers eventually arrived and entered the room, I told them discreetly where the man was. They searched the room while I remained at the front, but I was startled to see that there was no one else there. Watery shoe prints were all over the back door, but there were fresh tracks outside. Going directly from the gas station into the pitch-black, deserted field that led to miles in the snow was obviously impossible for anyone to search at night. But even when they did in the days that followed, they found nothing. The field was enormous, and he could have gone anywhere, but it was extremely cold, and I don't know how or why, but it was windy that night, and I was almost certain that they would find a body. The SUV was taken in for hopefully more information, but for some reason, they were unable to locate any ownership history, leaving us with only what we know about the man and what he was doing is still unknown, and his current location is as much of a story for mystery. This year, I started my first job as a Pizza Hut delivery driver. I chose Pizza Hut because it's not that busy these days, and I didn't want a job that would keep Me stressed out all the time. The first few months went by with nothing of interest. It was a very dull and repetitive job that left most days as forgettable. But then I had one experience that I'll never forget. I'm 16. So this was only a part-time job that I did after school a couple days a week. I didn't realize it was Friday, and we received an order right before closing. The address wasn't too far away, but it passed through a section of town I rarely visited. This neighborhood was distinct from the others, with few homes or businesses, so I had no reason to ever go there. As I drove through, I kept checking my GPS, and it led me all the way through the neighborhood, turning down what seemed like every road until the GPS indicated a waypoint on the right side. So I double-checked by looking up the address on Google. It was the real address of the park. I parked on the side of the road, grabbed the pizza, got out, and walked up to the path with a better view. Finally, it said that I had arrived, but something was strange. On my left was a row of maybe 6 or 7 houses, and on my right was a path leading to a park. I expected to see a group of kids who had placed an order for pizza, but instead I saw a man sitting on a bench a short distance down, waving at me. I started to approach, still a little unsure, but as I got closer, he got up and began looking through his wallet for cash. I was dubious because he was by himself on a nighttime walking path and, for some reason, needed a pizza delivered here. I went up to greet him and we started exchanging everything, but as we were speaking, the man started repeating the same thing to himself. He stopped talking and looked up at me, and I saw fear and helplessness in his eyes that I don't think I've ever really seen in someone's look before. His words, "I'm okay and everything's going to be okay," gave me the impression that I kind of needed to ask him he was okay. Of adrenaline shot through me, and when I turned around, I saw a tall man with a cloth mask covering his face. He held me at knife point and yelled at me to throw everything on the ground and empty my pockets. I immediately followed his instructions, but my fear only grew when he began pushing me and the man from the bench off the path and into the trees, leaving everything on the ground and not caring about any of it. We went for a few minutes, deep enough into the woods to lose sight of the path's light, before the man next to me abruptly pushed me to the ground and fled in the opposite direction. He was the man in the mask. Unexpectedly, he left me alone and fled after him. I immediately got back up and ran back to the path after hearing nothing else. A few minutes after I called the police, but both men had left and, based on what I know, are still gone. I'm not sure why the other victim pushed me down, but it was probably an attempt to leave me behind so he could escape. I don't blame him, but it was a low move that makes me feel a little less sorry for him. I'm not sure what the kidnapper planned to do, but the fact that he showed no interest in my wallet or possessions makes me think that something really terrible happened, even though it was the one that was driving a route to deliver the final pizza for the evening. The other victim's selfishness both put me in that terrible situation and saved me from story 5. It was well somewhere around 2 a.m. into the morning, since most of the town is spread out. The local pizza place where I work is one of the only ones that offers delivery in my small town. I was traveling through the forest that encircled our town on a seldom used side road that conveniently ran from one side to the other without stoplights or intersections. As I went, my car began to feel strange, so I checked my gas, but it was at half, and there were no other ignoring the icons that appeared on my dashboard. I assumed it was nothing, but as I continued driving, my car started to struggle. It was shifting unevenly back and forth as I tried to keep up speed, and eventually it just stopped accelerating. I turned it off to the side of the road and stopped it halfway in the grass. I was a little annoyed. I looked again. I rubbed my eyes in frustration as I tried to turn the car back on, but I was unsuccessful. I calmly got out and checked the outside of the car for any signs of damage, but it was an extremely old vehicle, and to be honest, I had no idea what to look for. I looked down the road, but all I saw was fog and I got back in my car and called one of my co-workers, who was also a friend, asking if he could do me a favor and pick me up. He agreed, but it would take another half hour. I thanked him and then called the customer to inform them of my predicament. However, when I turned to face the trees I had come from, I noticed a figure far out standing in the fog on the opposite side of the road, and expressed regret for the inconvenience. They were understanding, so all I could do was wait. After a moment, I remembered the figure I had seen, so I looked in my mirrors, but I couldn't see anyone by the trees or on the side of the road, even though it was quite dark and foggy. I then sat back once more and opened the box of pizza, taking a piece for myself as I waited, but as time passed, I began to feel uneasy about being out on this deserted road with very little vision. I could only see a few feet into the forest before it was completely dark, and the fog on the road seemed to get thicker over time. I waited for half an hour, keeping my eyes open and constantly checking the mirrors, when I heard footsteps growing closer and closer as they came from the shadows of the forest. I gazed at the empty fog and noticed a man approaching one of them. He approached my car and knocked on the window, grinning amiably at me. I'm sorry, but I can't roll the window down," I said through the glass, unsure of what else to say. The man remained silent, but then he casually attempted to open the door before making his way around to the back. I glanced in the mirror as he stood by the trunk, seemingly attempting to. The man was hiding for a moment, shifting around with something in his hands. When headlights from down the road appeared through the fog, he watched as the car slowed down and began to pull in behind me. Then he ran into the forest, losing my sight in the fog. My friend appeared to have noticed the man too, as he approached my car with extreme caution, and we ended up leaving my car behind. My friend informed me that the man was carrying a gun before he fled into the forest. We called the police and had a tow truck come and retrieve the car, which had been broken into and looted. It turned out that the gas meter was stuck in the middle and that the tank was empty, but there was nothing on the man. He obviously robbed the car, but what would he have done to me if he had attempted to do so while I was inside? Why was he out on that deserted road in the middle of the night? All I can say is that I'm fairly certain I wouldn't have been seen if my friend hadn't arrived when he did. Story 6. In my late 20s, driving a delivery service was never my first job choice. However, I was laid off during CO, and the only employer was a neighborhood pizzeria. Although it was well known in our town, the pizza was merely basic. I was working extra hours and keeping busy until closing time every night at 1 a.m. when everyone was staying inside and placing delivery orders. It was just another day of rushing to ease around town. And at around 12, we received I accepted a call for 4 large pizzas for a house about 30 minutes outside of town. I knew it would be my last order anyhow, and since it was a large order, the payment would probably cover the longer drive. By 12:15, I started to drive to the house, but the drive wasn't particularly noteworthy because all the roads were deserted, and no one was outside because of the mandatory lockdowns in place. However, I was instantly perplexed when I arrived at the address. There was a driveway with a big open gate that appeared to belong to a large mansion of some sort, but at the end of the driveway was nothing but a dead end with forest all around, save for a glowing light that was visible far away in the trees. I parked in the middle of the driveway and got out, and now that I was outside, I could see it was more obvious that it was some sort of campfire or bonfire, and I could hear a group of people conversing. After a while, a figure moved in front of the fire's glowing light and waved at me as if to invite me to bring over the pizzas. It goes without saying that this was not normal in any way, but both their gesture and the sounds of the group of people more than satisfied me. Reason to think it was just a group of college students hanging out. After all, they ordered 4 large pizzas, so it all made sense to me. I grabbed the pizzas from the back seat and turned on the headlights as I started to leave the driveway and head into the trees. As I got closer, a few more people appeared in the light. All of them watching me approached the bonfire there. I stood on the edge of the site and sort of held the pizzas up. There were half a dozen more people standing and sitting there, and, oddly, none of them seemed happy that the pizza was here. There were no other people in the yard, no music players, no games, no beer bottles, or any other type of drink. I was clumsily hoping that one of them would approach to take them and pay. A moment later, a man came over and took the boxes, giving them to someone else. The eerie atmosphere of this place was making me feel more uneasy with each second that went by before I could even request payment, but I could hear footsteps coming from the forest several times. More people entered the area toward the bonfire. At least a dozen of them were now staring at me and remaining silent. I had never before left without paying, but this situation literally made me shudder. I turned around and began to walk back to my car, but after glancing back a few times, I saw that they were still standing by the fire and that I could hear nothing of them conversing as I left the tree line. But my heart nearly stopped when two figures ran out from behind my car. They entered the forest directly and vanished past the headlights. I didn't even look inside my car to make sure nothing was missing. I just got in and backed out, racing down the road to get as far away from that as I could after returning to the shop. After some discussion, I called the police to have them check up on the group's suspicious behavior. It had been less than an hour since I had left, but when the police arrived, the only evidence of them was the bonfire still. Fortunately, my manager understood the strange situation, and I even tried calling the number they used to place the order, but they refused to answer. Burning but left alone. What actually transpired that night is unknown, and as far as I can tell, it will probably stay that way. Story 7. I worked as an overnight lead at a retail store in my 20s, but it wasn't one of your typical big chain grocery stores. Were local, with only 8 or 9 locations. Most nights, I would have an overnight stalker to assist, but it wasn't unusual for me to work alone the entire shift. Since it wasn't the largest store, it wasn't a particularly demanding workplace, and I frequently found myself working slowly to avoid running out of supplies. This was one of those nights when I worked alone and at a steady pace. I started my shift by loading up some boxes and stalking the aisles because it doesn't require much mental effort, so I wasn't really paying attention and my mind was elsewhere. I went through about 3 aisles before there was a knock at the front. I was so disoriented that I nearly missed the entrance, but once I did, I became very confused. I heard the knock again, loud enough to reverberate throughout the store. I walked to the end of the aisle and peered through the large front windows, noticing a man in a hood standing at the doors. I went up to the opposite side, where we're closed and will reopen at 8 a.m. The man glanced at me through the glass, but remained silent when I pointed to the notice on the man kept staring at me for a few seconds before turning and leaving, but it didn't appear that he had parked anywhere. The whole situation was strange, to put it mildly, but I assumed he was simply in the wrong place or something, so I went back to where I was. Door, we're closed. Sorry, I said again, eventually forgetting about the dude by 2 in the morning when replenishing the shelves. I left the boxes where they were after completing half of the aisles and getting ready for my lunch break, and proceeded to the break room at the opposite end of the building. I spent probably a good 30 minutes there before throwing away the remainder of my lunch and returning to work. I went through the store to the end of the aisle I was working on, but as I looked up, I noticed a man crossing the store without noticing me. I was frozen in place, experiencing that sudden rush of fear. As I listened carefully, I heard the man's footsteps approaching the side of the building I had just left, so I hid behind the shelves and moved into the aisle. The footsteps sounded like they were going toward the break room, but before I could try to flee and get assistance, I heard the man hurrying out of I ran for the other end of the aisle, looking back and saw the man turn in and start running at me. I got my keys out and tried to unlock the front door with unsteady hands. but the man appeared at the end of the aisle just as I had it open. The footsteps were now running through the store, getting closer and closer. I saw a bright flash in the corner of my eye as I was leaving the building, and then I heard a pop sound that made my ears ring. It was a gunshot, so loud that I couldn't even tell where it landed, but I ran for my life, made it to my car, and hid in the back seat while I called 911. From what I could tell, the man wasn't following me. By the time the police arrived at the store, he had left, but they discovered the back door broken open and some heavy tools next to it. What was most horrifying to them was the hole made by the gunshot, which was located directly next to the front doors. Why the man broke in and was so hostile toward me like that is I no longer work there, but I can tell you that 4 years after that incident, I was constantly on edge. The police, unsure of his behavior, seemed to believe it was some sort of mental breakdown or psychotic break, with no real reason to target me specifically other than the fact that I was alone. I work from home for a cybersecurity company, which isn't as exciting as it may sound. Story 8. I have to spend the entire night online, from 10 o'clock to 6 o'clock, scrolling through files full of code to see if anything poses a threat. This is incredibly tedious, and when combined with the overnight shift, it makes it difficult to stay up every night. A few weeks ago, I woke up at 2 in the morning one night. I forced myself to ignore my drowsiness while working and felt the weight of my eyes, repeatedly checking my phone in the hopes that the time had skipped ahead at 2:40. But I took a break and ordered some food to give me energy for the next 3 hours of my shift. I opened Uber Eats and saw that my only real option was to call Bell. So I placed an order and got up to get a drink as I went through the house with just the hallway lights on. When I woke up again, I noticed that it was raining. I had been so unaware of the rain while working that I was shocked to see how hard it was falling when I looked out the front window. My first thought was that I had just ordered for delivery and felt terrible for essentially forcing someone to run through the rain for my own convenience. I checked my phone and saw that the order had already been received, so I sat on the couch and waited for them to arrive. After about 10 minutes, I received a notification that the order had been picked up, so I looked at the Uber Eats map while the car drove across town and finally into my neighborhood. After a minute, I put my phone down and opened the front door so we could have a quick conversation. I stood at the open door and stared at the end of the road, which is where they should have been coming from, but 5 more minutes passed without. I picked up my phone and checked again, but the map showed that their car was still in my neighborhood. Zooming in, I saw that they were just around the corner before the turn onto my street. I looked outside again, but there were no lights from their car. My natural reaction was that they were either at the wrong house or couldn't see the address numbers because of the rain. I tried calling them a few times and they rejected it. I tried again, but couldn't get through, so I waited at the door for what seemed like 5 more minutes before I tried to call them again. This time it rang for a long time before they answered. I asked them where they were and if they needed assistance finding my house, but as I waited for their answer, all I could hear was the crackling sound of rain falling. After a few more seconds, I hung up, feeling strange about the call. I checked the map again. Initially, it hadn't updated, but when it did, I saw them directly outside my house. I also looked at the windows and noticed I closed the door and locked it because I had a terrible feeling that they were walking around in the rain like this. I swear I had only gone a few steps down the hallway when a loud knock shook the front door. I carefully looked through the peephole and saw a man in a grey hoodie pacing around on the porch with his head on a swivel, as if he was looking for any. As he waited impatiently for me to answer Uber Eats delivery, he yelled, but I didn't see a bag with my food, so I remained silent and didn't respond. The man's movements became more frantic, and he called out a few more times before abruptly pressing himself against the door, obstructing my view. I heard a few dull scars on the wood before he hurried to the side of my house and vanished in the rain. I called the police, but his car was gone, and I was informed that he was using a fraudulent account. A few days passed with nothing more to report until I saw a tiny X on my front door. That night, I still get a queasy feeling in my stomach, especially since he was holding a sharp object in his hand while he waited for me to open the door. It didn't appear to be made for me to see. Rather, it was more concealed, like a personal indicator for something. It might have just been a fluke, to frighten me, but I painted over it to hide whatever that marking was meant to mean. A part of me still believes that I will see Story 9 him again. In my mid-20s, I was the nighttime manager of a small retail business. The only reason I was officially a manager was because I would be the only overnight employee. Thus I was, and it was a weekday night, and a storm was just beginning to set in when I started my shift. During the first hour of my shift, the rain had increased and the wind was hitting the building much harder than before, making a lot of noise. I was in charge of checking stock, filling shelves, and occasionally receiving order shipments. I was really happy with the job and never found myself hating the work. I heard a thud reverberating through the building. I was filling the shelves for the first 2 hours, trying to finish the time-consuming tasks first. It sounded like it came from the back of the store, in the warehouse section where our delivery bay was. I walked over and saw the solid metal back door that truck drivers used to get in when making deliveries. The more I considered it, the more I convinced myself that the thud at this door sounded like a bang, as if a driver was attempting to make a delivery, but none were planned for tonight. I opened the door to find a face covered in wind and cold rain. I briefly peered out to look down at the shipping bay, but there were no trucks there. I shut the door and dried off as I made my way back to the building. I thought the noise might have been the building shifting slightly due to the wind, or perhaps it was just some odd thunder that I hadn't heard before. I worked for another hour, and then took a lunch break in the back office, staying there for maybe 15 minutes before leaving again. But as I was moving through the store, I had the odd impression that everything had become quiet except for the rain tapping on the roof, which made me shiver. As I got to the end of the aisle, I noticed something that nearly stopped my heart, a line of wet shoe prints running halfway down the aisle. I went straight to it without giving it any thought and tried to understand how this could have happened. I followed them all the way to the front of the store until I noticed so many wet footprints that it was impossible to follow them. It was truly terrifying to realize that they had run all over the place. I hurried back to the office, locked myself inside, called the police, and waited. As I sat there, my fear only grew because I couldn't see outside the office door, and the sound of the rain hitting the building was too loud for me to hear anything else. After 10 minutes, the person who had put me on hold returned to the phone and informed me that the police were outside the building. I hurriedly got up and opened the door, and there were 2 more sets of wet footprints on the floor, one next to mine. That led directly up to I ran to the front of the office I was in and rushed to let the police in. They searched the store and found no one there, but shortly after reviewing the security tapes, they showed us a man in a dark jacket entering through a side door that had been left unlocked. He obviously saw me right away and remained hidden until I took a break. The most eerie and terrifying part was when I went into the office and waited for the police. The man approached and stood outside the office door for several minutes, staring at the doorknob as if he was getting ready for me to enter. He didn't steal or break anything. He just wandered around aimlessly and looked at the shelves. Fortunately, he chose to leave the business a short while later. No further video of him was captured after that, and from what I've been told, he was never located. What he was doing that evening is still unknown, and will probably continue to be a source of unease for the story 10. The rest of my life. This occurred last autumn, as the season was coming to an end, and winter was approaching. Moreover, it can get quite cold, and even snow in October, where I live. I've been delivering food for the past 3 years, and this night it was about 10 o'clock, and I was one of the few automobiles traveling around, but a lot of orders were coming in. After driving all around until almost 1 a.m., it was still lightly snowing outside, and since it was one of the first snowfalls, people must have been reluctant to leave as the snow was beginning to melt and I was starting to feel a bit worn out. I picked up one last order. I drove by the McDonald's where they had placed their order, picked up the meal, and then put in the instructions to the house, which was just 10 minutes away. However, I was annoyed with myself when I turned out of the parking lot and onto the road. The plough trucks were still not out yet, likely because they weren't anticipating this much downfall, but my SUV was in the opposite direction from where I lived, and I was already a good 25 minutes from home, so it was going to be a long drive home. Long drive home was typically good in the snow, so I wasn't anxious when I was driving. However, I noticed that the road I was taking was going to leave the town's main area. I looked at the map again and saw that it was going in this direction, but it was a very unusual one, and I wasn't even aware that there were any houses down there because the road is only used to get to the highway that leads out of state. For a few minutes, I was only able to see streetlights and trees before approaching the turn, which was a single small street leading off the road. I slowed down and was extra cautious because this street was smaller and had trees lining it, making it extremely dangerous to slide off. As I descended at night, I noticed several lengthy drives that led to dim lights in distant trees. Before I arrived at the lane I was supposed to turn down, it appeared to be identical to all the others. I drove slowly through the driveway until I arrived at the house, which was medium-sized and older and entirely covered in. I parked outside, grabbed the bag, and began walking up to the door. The snow was thicker than I would have liked, soaking my shoes and even the lower legs of my pants. When I reached the porch, I knocked and began setting the bag down. Other than that, nothing particularly noteworthy about it seemed to be happening. "I received your order right here," I said, holding the bag up, but almost instantly the door opened, and when I looked up, I saw a big man in a winter jacket. His face was pale, as if he had just been outside in the cold. After a while, the man moved back and opened the door. The way he said, "Wider, you can set it down right over there," made me feel as though I had to go into the kitchen, even though I knew it would be a terrible idea. I looked at the man's hands and saw that he was holding nothing, so it really didn't make sense for me to do anything but give him the bag. "I apologize, but I really have to leave," I said, trembling, and held the bag up once more. The man frowned, then abruptly slammed the door shut. Still holding the bag up, I put it on the porch and hurried back to my car, but as soon as I got there, I heard something coming from behind me as I was walking past the front yard. I turned around and realized it was coming from somewhere on the opposite side of the house. It might have been a back door or something, but it was too muffled to hear. I was getting really uneasy, so I walked more quickly and got into my car. I turned it on, and as soon as I looked up, I saw the man approaching from the side of his house and hurrying over to me. He was holding something in his hands that almost looked like rope, but I couldn't make out what it was. Suddenly, my heart began to race, and my body was overcome by adrenaline. I started moving backwards, doing everything I could to move quickly and avoid getting stuck in the snow. The man was probably just I don't know what the man was doing, but the entire situation was so frightening and perplexing that I didn't even want to consider it. A few feet away, before my car could grab onto the road and begin to accelerate, I backed up through the entire driveway, watching him finally stop, and watched he slowly faded into the darkness as I backed up into the street. I still deliver food, but now I'm much more careful and usually don't even knock on doors anymore. Instead, I just leave the food on the porch and go. If I had stayed up that night or gone inside, I don't know what would have happened to me. Story 11. I work as a crew manager at a 24-hour drive-through restaurant, and this happened just a few weeks ago. I primarily do the same tasks as everyone else, which is to cook and take orders. During the night, we always have at least 2 employees, one of whom is a manager and the other is typically when I called the other cooks to ask if they could cover a shift. None of them said they could, so by 12 a.m. the cook had called. In all this evening, I was the sole employee. Nowadays, the restaurant typically doesn't get very busy at night, and more staff members arrive at 4 a.m. Therefore, even though I wasn't working a full shift, I still had to complete everything. For 4 hours, I started working on the things I had planned for the evening by cleaning and scraping the stovetops, but after a few minutes I heard a banging noise coming from the front of the restaurant. I went down and glanced over the counter to see a man standing at the front door, banging on it, and then he pressed his face against the glass, looked around the room, and then fixed his gaze on me. I approached the door, and as I approached, he retreated and waited as if I was going to open it. I shouted through the glass that our dining area was closed, and that he needed to use the drive-thru if he wanted to place an order. He appeared perplexed, so I yelled again that the doors were locked and he needed to use the drive-thru, but he didn't respond at the time, so I wasn't sure if he understood. I decided to turn around and head back to the kitchen, figuring he would eventually figure out that the doors weren't opening. I spent at least 15 to 20 minutes working on the stovetops during this time. A few minutes after I finished with the stoves, I received a notification from my headset that someone was in the drive-thru. I turned on my microphone and asked for their order as I walked to the window, but no one responded. I went to the front once to see if the man had left, and from what I could see, he was gone. The entire parking lot was deserted, and the man was not at the door. As soon as I saw on the camera that there was no car outside, I ignored it and began to walk back. However, as I reached the back room, I slowed down and stopped when I thought I heard something. I stood there and listened as footsteps slowly moved across the building's roof. They were moving carefully and didn't make much noise other than the roof creaking, but I knew that someone was up there. I followed the sound of their footsteps down the ceiling until I came across the ladder that led to the maintenance hatch. When I realized what they were doing, I ran to the ladder and began searching for a lock of some kind. Prevent the hatch from opening, but I had never used it, so I had no idea how it operated or whether it even locked. Then, a loud creak came from the ceiling directly above me, followed by a few thuds from the hatch's exterior. After a little while, the hatch creaked open a little, and all I could see through the tiny gap was a pair of eyes staring back at me. I heard loud thuds coming from the hatch, so I hurried to the front of the building, unlocked the door, and fled for my car. I called the police, sat inside the restaurant, and as I was on the phone, I saw a shadow passing by the front counter, and then a man appeared standing in the far back of the restaurant, but was staring at me. After a while, he turned and vanished behind the kitchen, leaving me in a panic. The police arrived and searched the building and the roof, but the man had already fled, and nothing was missing. No money or equipment was taken. He had simply broken in and left. I tried not to think about it too much, but it's difficult not to assume that he was there for me. As I mentioned earlier, this happened quite recently, so there hasn't been much information released about it. Even with his face on the cameras, his identity hasn't been confirmed. The building's owner did, however, install a padlock inside the hatch, which was a necessary addition. I still wonder about the man's intentions and whether he was waiting for me to be alone again before he attempted story 12, but I suppose it was simply an inconvenience. I spend a lot of my free time doing. I started driving at 9 p.m. to make deliveries for DoorDash, which allows me to earn extra money without having to commit to a more rigorous second job. On this evening, and gradually assumed some orders until 11 o'clock, when it slowed down a little. During this time, I simply drove around the mall, which housed the majority of the fast food restaurants that people frequently ordered from. Eventually, another order arrived. It was a standard order that would be delivered roughly 4 miles away. After receiving the food, I began to follow the directions to the address, and it was almost immediately clear that it wasn't a house. I scrolled in on the map, which only displayed streets and buildings, and the address it led to was on a street with no buildings. It appeared to be an empty plot of land. However, the DoorDash map was never very good, so I just decided to drive and at least check it out, and if there were any problems, I might call the customer. I left in just under 20 minutes. The street was extremely desolate, with no houses, crossroads, or cars on it. When I reached the end, it turned into a gravel road with a small wooden sign on the side that was to warn to read. I turned on my brights and pulled onto the gravel, and immediately I could see something far down. The road! The road! I pulled closer, and as I got closer, my phone beeped to inform me that I had reached it. In my headlights, I saw a small mobile home or some sort of RV, with shoddy painted numbers on the door. I glanced back at my phone and saw that the address was 2760, and I got out with the food in my knocked and waited. It was a rare cash order, which made more sense after I saw the location, but it didn't make me feel good as I approached the RV. It was a little unnerving to look at. It was old and overgrown, which was odd given that it was a mobile home meant to be moving around. Having to stand here, I felt uneasy as I looked around. The area was encircled by forests, and there were no lights outside the RV. It was pitch black. I heard something coming from within, so I was about to wait for them to open the door when I heard a voice shock me from the right. I turned to see a man grinning at me from the corner of the RV. He asked if I had his order, so I nodded and apologized before passing it to him. I told him it was total, and he took out a $5 bill from his pocket before grinning again and saying he only needed to get that the entire exchange in writing doesn't seem as strange as it did in person. But I can tell you that there was something really wrong with this guy. It was just something about the way he acted and said everything that made me shiver. I waited for about a minute before becoming more anxious and turning to look at his destination. I noticed a figure standing by what appeared to be the dark outline of a shed in the distance. They weren't moving, they were just standing there. As my anxiety increased, my head jolted as I heard the RV door open and saw another man staring out at me. I was about to welcome him when he slammed the door shut, and my pulse began to race. I turned to face the man standing by the shed, who was now making his way back toward the RV while holding something else in his hands. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was either a long bat or I don't know what happened there, but I wasn't exactly eager to find out, so I went straight home afterward and considered calling 911, but I was caught up on the situation. Rifle. I ran back to the car, got in, and put it in reverse with shaky hands. A man came around the side of the mobile home and stood calmly in the darkness as I drove off. Since I ultimately had no idea what was happening, I regretfully chose not to call the police. Whatever transpired that evening will just be remembered as the odd experience it was, with no explanation for the actual nature of back when it had essentially just begun. I was driving through my city delivering for Postmates. Every order was primarily placed inside the main city blocks, but I had just received an order from outside the main roads. I picked up the food and went over, but the farther I left the city, the fewer cars and houses there were on the roads. Everything was replaced by the woods. I had been out this way previously, but only when I was going out of town. I drove till the GPS instructed me to stop, since I knew there were residences out here. Turn into a gravel road that was nearly invisible because there were no lights nearby. As I walked along this narrow trail through the woods, away from the dim ones emanating from my old automobile, to be honest, it took a full minute to get to the house, which was much longer than I had anticipated. It would appear that because of its remote setting in the forest, it was old, and the house was almost completely constructed of wood, with vines growing up the exterior. A few lights were on inside, illuminating through the windows, but I doubt I would have approached it if there hadn't been. After making sure everything was in order on the back, I went to the front door and pressed the doorbell, which didn't actually work, so I had to knock as well, because the door creaked when my hand touched it. Carefully opening it a bit farther, I yelled, I have an order. I came here from Postmates, and when I called out to anyone at home again, there were no sounds emanating from within, yet every light I could see was on, and I could make out a TV through the gap in the doorway. It was playing in the living room, but it was muted. I'm not sure how else to elucidate my feelings, but the vibes seemed strange, and I sensed something wasn't right. So I turned and returned to Maya. Sensed an issue as soon as the automobile got in and began to make a U-turn. My car was having trouble moving through the gravel and felt like it was bumping a lot because the steering was stiff. I was apprehensive when I came out, and my face froze when I noticed that my front tire was. When I looked at the other tires, I saw that they were all flat. Also flat, not slightly deflated, but totally. My gut fell the moment I realized this was a deliberate act. At that time, my thoughts were all over the place, and what scared me was that I wasn't sure if someone had come up while I was at the house, or if they had placed something on the walkway, carried out behind my back. In any case, all I knew was that someone was. I went back in my car and drove away, far out in the middle of nowhere in the woods. I tried to contact 911 after locking the doors, but I couldn't get through. Few choices. I noticed the front door opening wider and a light flickering in the house. Seeing a man in the doorway, he began without hesitation. Instead of second-guessing myself this time, I hurried to my car. I noticed the man stop while I was in drive and pushing my car through the gravel in the mirror and gaze at my vehicle. Once I've entered the main road, I drive more cautiously and slowly to avoid damaging my automobile until I have enough signal strength to make a call. 911. But the events that followed were just as horrifying. A single mother and her 2 children owned and resided in that home, all of whom claimed that they never placed an order, and that they were at the house sleeping in their rooms when I made this allegation, or even discovered anything missing in their house. I'm not sure if they were complicit, why the man bought dinner for them, or if they were as much of a victim. I was house and cut my tires, but I still don't get it. The only explanation think of is that perhaps he was going to commit a terrible act against that family, and I was going to be set up in some way to be held accountable, because it's possible that I was present at the property when it was committed. Be a reach, but if it's accurate, my escape could have prevented additional deaths. More than just my own four. I went on a road trip to a forest a few hours away in 2015, and I was really excited to explore the hike up to an abandoned fire lookout. I should note that it was technically illegal to camp or go inside because it wasn't maintained and could be structurally unstable, but I did some research online and most people said it seemed fine. But the last post I could finding out about it was 3 years ago, so I wasn't really sure what I would find when I got there. Nevertheless, I discovered a small ditch on the roadside where I could park, took out my backpack with 2 days' worth of supplies, and began the hike. Since there aren't usually designated routes to get there, I used a handheld satellite GPS to ensure that I was headed in the right direction the entire time. I spent 4 to 5 hours hiking through unknown terrain in the woods. The farther I went, the rougher and denser the terrain became. I was really hoping that the fire lookout would still be there and suitable for camping, but if not, I would probably have to find another nearby location to set up my tent and sleep at after the exhausting few hours. When I finally arrived after hiking through the woods, I could see the building peeking out over the trees. It looked to be in decent shape. The paint was obviously worn off, but it seemed to be holding up well. I gave the support beams a few shoves, and they seemed really solid, so I tried my luck climbing the ladder, which was made of metal and felt sturdy, but it still creaked with each step. I briefly marveled at the views from the top. I could see the entire forest 4 miles in all directions, devoid of any houses, roads, or buildings. After admiring the scenery, I went around the ledge and entered the lookouts, which were quite tiny, not like the large ones that are converted into airbns or anything, just a single room that was perhaps 150 square feet in size. There wasn't much else to look at in there, so I put my bag down, rolled out my mattress and sleeping bag, and then heated up a meal on my little camping stove. When the sun was setting, I walked out to the ledge and watched it. It was by far one of the best views I'd ever seen, but it seemed to pass quickly. There was a rotting bed in the corner, an old wooden desk in the other corner, and rotting windows running the length of the wall. It was probably an hour into the night when I noticed something below me, a light moving around in the trees, but it wasn't like artificial light. It had this orangish hue and was gentle. After that, it was just darkness. It was cloudy outside as well, so there was no moonlight or stars lighting up the sky. I sat on the ledge for a while with nothing else to do, a flickering, somewhat like a campfire would, which made me think it was a torch. He was moving between the trees in the forest not far from where I was, and since there wasn't even a trail to get here, it was extremely unlikely that anyone else would be out here at the same time as me. Additionally, moving around at night, without a standard flashlight and using a torch was rather oddly. I watched for a while as the light moved beneath the trees before disappearing behind something. For the next half hour, I never saw it again, but I continued to enjoy the peace and quiet of the night from the ledge until the wind began to make it a little chilly. So I got up to have one last look before going inside. Even though there was someone there, they were standing at the bottom in the grassy area between the fire lookout and the woods, and it appeared as though they were staring up at me. Perhaps it was the person with the light I had seen earlier. "Hello," I called out, unsure of what else to say, and they didn't move or respond. They just looked at each other for a strange 10 or 15 seconds before lifting up their hand in an acknowledging or apologetic manner. Then they turned around and entered the woods without any lights. This was obviously very spooky and unsettling, but for some reason, I was certain at the time that it was just another hiker wishing to remain in the lookouts. He was most likely just looking up to see if anyone was inside already, which is why he hesitated to answer, only raised his hand. I don't know. I stayed outside for a little while longer, but seeing nothing else, so I went inside and warmed up my sleeping bag. The wind pelting the windows and the creaking of the wooden beams made it difficult to fall asleep, but I finally passed out. It's difficult to tell how much time had passed, but when I woke up, the wind had after settling in. It was still quite dark outside. I opened my eyes and wondered why I had just woken up, but then I heard the ladder's soft metal creak outside. I thought I might be mistaken, but then I heard it repeatedly. Someone was climbing up the ladder. I couldn't tell how far up or down they were. I could only hear the hinges at the top of the ladder creak with each step. They went outside the windows, but it was pitch black. I unzipped my sleeping bag, picked up my backpack, and walked onto the ledge. In the 20 or so seconds it took to get up, the creaking grew louder and faster, as if they were in a hurry, before it abruptly stopped. As I reached the ledge, I stood there for a moment, waiting for another sound, and then I walked around the window slowly, walkway, and looked around the corner at the ladder's opening. Nobody was there. I cautiously approached, feeling my heart rate rise as I leaned over and looked down. There was no one on the ladder. I was momentarily stunned, terrified, and unsure of what the hell was going on when a series of footsteps rushed around the wooden walkway behind me. I only saw I didn't think twice about lowering myself onto the ladder and hurrying down after, catching a glimpse of their dark figure running between the windows on the opposite side. It was terrifying to try to descend the slick metal ladder, because my entire body was trembling from the adrenaline rush, and someone was chasing me right above me. I was halfway down when I noticed their head peeking out from above, and I didn't stop until I reached the bottom and entered the woods. Honestly, I don't know. With my flashlight and GPS on me, I was able to hike my way out of there and back to my car. As far as I know, I wasn't followed, so I drove away and never looked back. That's why I even grabbed my backpack when I woke up to see what was happening. But it was the best choice I've ever made, and may have even saved my life. Music story to by Andrew LM. The first day was just that I arrived. set up camp, and relaxed for the entire day and night at a small lake. It was kind of out in the middle of nowhere, with a thin footpath leading to it, but no maps online or anything. So it wasn't really intended to be anything special, just a few days in the woods by the water to unwind, and nothing more. Only locals would likely be aware of it. My dad used to take me there when I was a child, and throughout the years I have visited, both as a child and as an adult, I have never seen anyone else. In fact, there were never any indications that anyone else had ever been there. On my second day, I spent some time walking around the water, and I suppose I just thought I must have circled the lake 3 or 4 times. Everything was peaceful and pleasant for a while during those hours of walking. But then, while making a lap around the lake, I noticed some footprints in the dirt just on the edge of the tree line. I had been walking the same circle over and over again, but I had never seen them before, and their location was so clear and obvious that I doubt I would have missed them. They also appeared fairly new, and what was really odd was that the footprints indicated that someone else was present, but they were actual footprints barefoot, not shoe prints, and the area of the lake where I was not even close to the water, so it's not like they removed their boots before swimming. In addition, I would have seen them in the lake, so for some reason, I was really uneasy about not seeing them. It was difficult to avoid becoming paranoid about them when I was walking around because they were watching me and didn't want me to see them. From what I could see, it appeared that the footprints went up to the tree line overlooking the lake and then straight back into the woods, where they seemed to go for a while. Since I didn't want to follow them into that uncharted area of the forest, I simply walked back to my campsite. I kept checking the lake, or, I suppose, the tree line surrounding the lake to see if anyone was there, but I never did. As the sun began to set, my paranoia began to flare up again, because something about the footprints felt strange, and even though I knew they were probably still close by, it wasn't reassuring. As night fell, I built a fire with plenty of wood, and sat around it. I tried everything I could to distract myself from it, but it was really tough. Part of me felt justified in my uneasiness, and another part of me thought I was exaggerating. But not too far into the night, I heard footsteps coming from the trees. I turned as soon as I heard them, and there were more than one. It sounded like two people slowly approaching. I dared toward them at the campsite until they abruptly came into view. It was a man and a woman walking side by side and stopping just outside the area where the fire's light could reach them. I couldn't see much of their faces or anything more than their basic shapes, so I couldn't even tell how old or young they were. When I said, "Can I help you?" the woman turned and ran away, disappearing entirely into the woods. But the man remained there without moving or even turning to face the woman. It was at that moment that I noticed he had no shoes on, and I asked again if I could help him, but he turned around and walked back into the woods in silence. I basically had an internal panic after that. In fact, that was the most. I was not the type of person to stay in those woods for another second after an unsettling and strange encounter that almost didn't feel real. Fortunately, my setup was simple to set up and take down, so I had everything tied down in my bag and ready to go in a matter of minutes. I wasn't sure where they went, but I didn't want to remain there. I threw out all the unlit logs from the fire here in case they returned, so that it would go out quickly after I left, and then I rushed into the woods. The walk took almost 2 hours, and for the first 10 minutes I was really nervous, wondering if I was being followed, but the farther I got, the better I felt. About 40 minutes into the walk, the entire woods was quiet, with not even a cricket or anything. When I could see nothing, so I had to keep walking when I heard running footsteps nearby, maybe 100 feet away. A few minutes later, I heard it again, but this time on the opposite side of me. The footsteps seemed quieter than they should have been, which made me assume that they were barefoot, and that they were the same two I had seen at the lake. If they had been stalking me this far into the woods, who knows what they were trying. to do. For a while, I kept hearing distant running footsteps, just brief pauses as if they were silently following me. And then they would suddenly run off. I can't think of anything more terrifying than that walk through the woods, but I managed to return to my truck. I never went back. Music Story 3 by Unexplained. Wish I had more to say there. That I had worked out who that man and woman were, or what they were doing out there, but I have nothing. Maybe I'm crazy, but sometimes I wonder if they were even alive or not. I'm not sure if I want to. I'm a female from the north who is 24 years old. Although there are many different lifestyles that people choose to live in these types of vans or RVs, I always tried to stay away from large cities and stick to small towns for camping in between destinations. However, for the most part, I enjoyed camping out in the backcountry, in the middle of the woods, in Arizona a few years ago. I think that part of the reason I loved traveling so much was that it was always safer to be alone in the forest than it was to be stealthily camping in a busy parking lot in the middle of a city. Don't get me wrong, it can still get spooky at night, but I always know that I'm better off out there with no one around. This week, I was traveling slowly. I was taking my time between two large cities in Washington, staying on the back roads, and camping for several days at a time. On this particular day, I pulled off the road and onto a small dirt trail that led deep into the forest. There were a few pull-off spots, but none were occupied, and it appeared that no one had been down here recently, so I continued in the hopes of finding a larger and more picturesque spot. I leveled out my van and parked because there wasn't much to do outside because it was the middle of spring and it was raining almost every day in Washington. I opened the side door of my van to get some fresh air while I cooked. The spot at the end was a large circle to pull off on. It wasn't picturesque, just surrounded by trees, but it was large, secluded, peaceful, and even had a stone circle in the middle for a campfire. A meal on my propane stove. It was almost sunset, so I had a few hours before going to bed. Over the next half hour, the sun set and the rain began to come down. I closed the door to keep the water out and instead opened a small window near the back of the van. I sat on the bed and watched a show on my laptop, but halfway through, a glare came in from the open window behind me. Before I could react, a light was reflected onto my laptop screen. It disappeared, but it didn't move away as if someone had turned off the light. When I turned around and looked out the window, I saw nothing. It was still pouring outside, and it was very dark. I had no way of knowing how far the light was coming from or what it was, as it was on a trail with other pull-offs. The only issue was that the light didn't come from the road I came down. Behind my window, there were only trees. Perhaps there was another trail I wasn't aware of, but there wasn't much I could do to investigate, so I turned around. In some places, I had to assume it was just another camper. Perhaps their headlights somehow made their way through the trees and shone into my window. They then promptly turned off their vehicle and returned to my laptop. Every now and then, I would glance out the windows or think I heard something outside, but it was difficult to tell if I was hearing anything or not because of the rain clattering against the metal roof. I never saw anything to confirm that something was outside, so I didn't worry too much. I'd like to say it was around 10 or 11 when I made the decision to call it in for I tried to sleep by turning off everything in the van, closing all the windows and drawing the shades. It was almost completely dark inside, so I got under the covers and tried to sleep. Normally, I had no trouble falling asleep, but tonight I just couldn't. The rain got worse after an hour, and then thunder started to roll in, which was so loud that it was impossible to even try to sleep. Somewhere just outside of my van, I was sleeping about 2 hours into the night when I swear I heard something move outside through all the thunder and rain. It was loud enough for me to know I actually heard something, and it sounded like someone or something running and kicking over a branch on the ground. As soon as I heard it, there were no more sounds, and it was so dark that I couldn't even see the ground beneath the window. I put the window cover back down and sat there, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But a minute later, I heard a male voice, kind of in a loud whisper, like they were talking to someone else. I sat in silence, too afraid to open the covers and look out the windows again, because I felt more uneasy the longer I looked out there. Probably see me, if they haven't already, but they probably could already assume someone was in the van, which makes it even more terrifying. I didn't hear anything for at least 2 or 3 minutes other than the thunder and rain. And then, all of a sudden, there was something outside the van's sliding side door. It sounded like bending plastic, as if someone were leaning against the side door. And then there was a knock, and a few seconds later, they knocked again. I was certain that they already knew I was in here, but I was still too afraid to talk. Perhaps they didn't know how many people were inside or whether I was a man or a woman, so I felt safer keeping quiet and not giving them anything. 5 tense and unsettling minutes passed, as the knocking persisted every few seconds without. I didn't believe that for a moment, because if it were true, why wouldn't they have said that right away? They kept knocking and calling out various lines, all of which essentially stated that they were an officer and that I needed to open the door. If anyone was saying anything, they must have been completely soaked by this point and probably couldn't see at all due to the weather. I slowly lifted the window cover and looked out, but all I saw was a dark figure moving near the door. Based on his appearance, he didn't appear to be wearing any kind of law enforcement gear, so I knew that this was going to get really bad. I debated what to do for 30 seconds as it felt like the knocking was getting more and more impatient. I heard 2 sets of footsteps running up to the side of the van as soon as I got up there and turned the car on. I started to pull out just as a figure appeared in the window next to me. Thank God the van didn't get stuck, and I was able to get out onto the trail. Driving away, I never saw any other cars down the road, which makes the intentions clear of these unidentified individuals was probably extremely upsetting. I filed a report with the county, who naturally stated that there were no officers present that evening, but I never had any follow-up, which may have led to terrible outside. But I haven't experienced anything since then. Other things have happened.